Hello, welcome to another reading from the Scargatherer series. If you've only just discovered this series, then I'm just going to give you a very quick run of what there is so far and what there is to come. So the Scargatherer series, as some of you will know and some of you may not, is 7 books and they go through time. So The Leopard in the Golden Cage, sorry if you haven't seen this before, because I use the front camera of my phone, it's a mirror image, so sorry about that. First book in the series, The Leopard in the Golden Cage. All 16 chapters of that are available, because I've read that one already, on Facebook, on the page that you're probably watching on, and also on YouTube. If you're watching this on there, they're also there. So there's 16 chapters of that. That's set in Roman times. That's the first book. On Saturday I just finished reading this book. This is the second book in the series, Saving the Unicorn's Horn, which is set in Viking times. Today we're going to start in with the Tudors. Hooray! I find myself feeling quite excited about that, actually. I love this book. The Falconer's Quarry. So we're going to start that today. At some point, whether we're all still in lockdown or not, I will carry on with the next book. The Demon in the Embers is The Great Fire of London. The 5th book in the series is Slaves for the Isabella. That's about the transatlantic slave trade. That's probably the most important thing I've ever written and will ever write, that book. And eventually we will come to The Shimmer on the Glass, which is set in Victorian Cornwall. And finally, The Ring from the Ruins, which is set in World War II. That would take me all the way into October or something like that, if I still carry on reading. So if you've just found me, my name's Julia Edwards. I am the author of this series, and the series is called the Scargatherer series. And there's a website. I wrote this out in mirror writing so that it would show correctly. There we are. That's the website for the series. So there's loads of stuff. If you're doing homeschooling stuff and you're wanting to do stuff about Tudors or Vikings or Romans or whatever, it's there. Okay, there's lots and lots there, and it's written for kids, and there's a lot in it that's quite good fun. Okay, so yeah, we're going to start The Falconer's Quarry today. This book is set actually very near where I live in Wiltshire, a place called Old Wardour Castle. It's astonishing. I went there with my kids for one of them had a birthday party there. It wasn't his birthday, it was a friend, and it was so amazing. We went back as a family to go and see it. It's a ruin. It was ruined in the Civil War, so in the 1640s or 50s. But it was built in Tudor times, somewhat before this book takes place, and it is amazing. It's absolutely amazing. So yeah, when I went there, I decided I just truly had to set a book there. So I rejigged the series. I had plans for the series, and I rejigged them all in order to write this book and fit this one in. Okay, The Falconer's Quarry, Chapter 1. Joe was out riding with Sam when it happened. In fact, they'd only just set off. "Aren't you coming with us?" he'd asked Dad as they stood in the stable yard. Dad grinned. "No thanks. I'll wait here. An hour in the sunshine with a newspaper sounds perfect to me." The lady from the stables approached. "I'm afraid we've got a bit of a problem. I'd booked you boys in for 2 of my beginner's horses, but one of them's looking a bit lame." She scratched her head. "My others are already out this morning. I do have a horse tacked up for someone who didn't come, but he can be a bit frisky. I normally only use him for people who've ridden before." "I have," Joe said. The lady brightened. "How many hours would you say?" Joe thought about it. There had been a few lessons with Heraclio at Fishbourne last summer, and then in February the long ride back to Jorvik across the snowy wastes after the ship burial. 4 or 5, I guess, perhaps a bit more. His brother turned on him. "When?" Joe shuffled his feet. "When you weren't there," he mumbled. The lady considered. "It's not much, but we should be okay." She strode over to one of the sheds and took down a pair of riding hats from the hooks. "Let's get going then." Dad waved cheerfully to Joe and Sam as they rode out of the gate and onto the bridle path. "I should have brought the camera," he called after them. "You look great." Joe beamed. Dad had let each of them choose a particular activity while they were away on holiday together this time, and riding had been Joe's choice. It felt good to be up on a horse again, and much more comfortable with the saddle and stirrups than it had been bareback behind Lucy. He pressed his heels into the horse's flanks experimentally. Immediately the animal sped up and overtook Sam's horse. "You seem to have a good seat," the lady said as he drew level with her, "though you're holding the reins a bit strangely. Keep them like this." She nodded at her own hands. "Like I showed your brother. That's better. You can go ahead if you like, but don't let the horse run away with you. You're in charge, remember?" Joe shifted his grip on the reins and dug his heels in a little more. The horse began to trot. Joe realised he had settled naturally into the correct rhythm on the animal's back. That was what Heraclio had been trying to get him to do. He'd found it difficult, the way you had to go up and down much more slowly than if you let the horse bounce you. Mind you, that beast had been single-minded about throwing him off whenever it could. He urged the horse on a little more. It responded at once, speeding up and changing gait. Cantering was so much better, Joe thought. It felt fast and smooth. He gave a very quiet whoop of delight, not wanting to frighten the animal. "At the bottom of the slope, we're going to go right," called the lady from behind him. "Don't get too far ahead, please." All at once, Joe began to panic. The end of the track was coming towards him rather quickly now, and he couldn't remember how to slow down or steer. Now that he thought about it, he wasn't even sure he knew. Lucy had held the reins last time. She had controlled the horse. All he'd had to do was stay on. He tugged the leather straps he was holding. The horse shied, confused. Joe realised he was digging his feet into its flanks, so he was urging the animal on, at the same time as he was pulling it back. He made himself relax his legs. It felt precarious, but the horse slowed down. Joe let his breath whistle out between his teeth. Tentatively, he pulled the right-hand rein. The horse turned towards the right and started along the next part of the route. Joe grinned. He could do this. It was going to be fine. As the horse walked along in the April sunshine, Joe became aware of a buzzing sound nearby. It grew abruptly very loud, and then just as suddenly stopped. He looked around, wondering what it might be. Crawling up the horse's shoulder was a giant wasp. Alarm tightened Joe's throat. He'd never seen such a huge wasp in his life. It was almost as long as his thumb, and a sort of reddish-brown rather than yellow. He swallowed. It wasn't a wasp. It must be a hornet. Slowly he turned in his saddle. The lady from the stables was still some way off up the track with Sam. If he shouted to them, the hornet might get angry and sting the horse. But otherwise he was going to have to do something. Otherwise it would crawl up onto his knee and sting him. His whole body tensed. The horse pricked up its ears and shook its mane, sensing his anxiety. Joe shifted the reins to his left hand. He would have to brush the hornet off and hope he didn't aggravate it too much. He gritted his teeth. There was only going to be one chance at this. He leaned forward and flicked the horse's shoulder with the leather strap. The horse started in surprise. The hornet rose up, buzzing furiously. It disappeared into the horse's ear. There was a moment of quiet. Then the animal screamed and reared up on its hind legs, flailing its hooves. Joe grabbed handfuls of mane and clung on desperately. He could feel himself sliding down its back. He clenched his knees to the saddle. The horse jerked its head frantically up and down. The Hornet flew out. Before Joe had time to catch hold of the reins, the horse had lunged forward and bolted down the path. Faster and faster they went. Joe found himself standing in the stirrups, bent forward like a jockey. All he could think of was not falling off. The horse galloped onwards, its ears flat back against its head. Fields flew past on either side. Then they were speeding along the edge of a copse. Joe looked up over the horse's head. Across the track in front of them was a 5-bar gate. The horse saw it too. It tried to stop, but it was too late. At the last moment it veered off the track into the copse. Joe was flung one way, then another. A branch swooped into his face. He ducked low and threw up his arm. Still the horse careered through the trees. And then without warning, Joe was flying through the air. His fingers were free of the horse's tangled hair, his limbs spread wide like a star. For one eternal second, everything was peaceful. Then he hit the ground with a rib-crunching smack. The world went dark. When he sat up, he didn't know whether a few seconds had passed or several minutes. He groaned. He felt sick and his head throbbed. The woodland around him was dim, though there were patches of sunlight on the ground here and there. He rubbed his face with his hands and peered through the trees. He couldn't see the track. The woods just stretched on and on, with no sign of fields beyond. Perhaps he was looking the wrong way. He could well have got disorientated by the bump he'd just had. He swivelled painfully round, but there was no sign of open ground between the trees in any direction. He frowned. He'd thought the woodland had been lighter than this, beeches and birches not yet fully in leaf, but overhead now were mostly fir trees, with the occasional oak between them. He could feel his brain struggling to get a message through to him, but it was like being underwater, hearing sounds that he couldn't make out. As the muddle began to clear, he looked down at himself. He caught his breath sharply. His clothes had completely changed. The horse had thrown him not just to the ground, but into another time. His stomach churned. "Not now," he wanted to shout. "I'm not ready for this. My ribs hurt, my head hurts, everything hurts." He closed his eyes, then opened them again. It was no good. He was still here. He sighed. There was nothing for it. He would have to try and figure out where, or rather when, he might be, preferably before anyone else came along. For now the only clues he had were the clothes he was wearing. He got up creakily and began to inspect them. On his feet were black leather shoes. They had rounded toes and a strap with a buckle. There were slits in the front with dark red cloth showing through. He snorted. They were the kind of shoes a small girl might wear back at home. Still, at least the soles were thick enough that he couldn't feel the ground through them. That was one up on Jorvik. Above the shoes his legs were covered by dark woolen stockings, and above them he wore a pair of long, loose shorts that were tight around his knees. They were made of crimson material, like a kind of thick felt, the same as the long jacket he was wearing. It wasn't exactly a jacket, though. If anything, it was more like a dress, with short sleeves and a narrow belt at the waist, and a wide skirt beneath. On the breast was an insignia, like on a school blazer, a black shield with 3 swords embroidered in silver and gold. Beside that, a line of metal buttons went up his chest all the way to his throat. When he squinted, he could just see a white frill over the high collar. At his wrists, matching frills peeped out from the cuffs of long black undersleeves. He tried to remember where he'd seen clothes like this before quite recently. That was it. He'd watched some of Wolf Hall on the TV with Dad, in which case this must be Tudor England, not the Elizabethan bit he'd been doing at school with its silk slashes and silly ruffs, but earlier. And by the look of it, he was rich too, or at least rich enough not to be a peasant. He felt pleased by this realization and by his own detective work. So if this outfit was some kind of doublet and hose, he lifted the open corners of the skirt. Sure enough, where the zip would be on his jeans, there was a flap of material laced onto the shorts. He chuckled to himself. That had to be the codpiece. He prodded it. To his disappointment, it was just a flap. He'd always thought that codpieces stuck out like a cricket box or a banana guard. Oh well, at least it would make things easier when he had to go for a pee. Attached to his belt, he noticed a leather purse. Perhaps there would be something in there to help him work out where he was. Inside was a comb made of bone or ivory, a blunt-looking knife in a sheath, and 3 silver coins. He looked closely at the coins, but couldn't make out a date on any of them. The face beneath the crown looked like it might be a man, but he couldn't be sure. What was definite was that the person's nose had a distinctly coppery glow. It looked daft. Surely it wasn't supposed to be like that. He straightened up and found that slung over his shoulder, slightly askew, he was also wearing a cloak. It was dark red, like his other clothes, and trimmed with black velvet. It seemed rather unnecessary in the warmth of the sunshine. He put his hand up to loosen the fastening. His fingertips brushed against metal. The chain of his St. Christopher slithered into his hand. There was no sign of the pendant. He bit his lip. He would have to find it. He knew for sure now that the St. Christopher was the key to getting into Lucy's world. He bent down and began to feel around in the dead leaves and pine needles of the forest floor. "Are you hurt?" Joe jumped up, startled. He'd been so busy scrabbling around he hadn't heard anyone coming. But there was a girl riding through the trees towards him, leading another horse by the reins. "Here's your mount," she said, nodding to the second horse. "I thought it was the least I could do to fetch him after you rescued me. I'm afraid he's torn his caparison. He was in such a lather, poor beast." Joe stood there, open-mouthed. There were so many things to say, he didn't know where to start. His horse? Rescue? Lucy? She was Lucy, wasn't she? He stared at the animal while he tried to gather his wits. It was the same size and the same chestnut colour as the horse he'd ridden out from the stables, and it had the same white line down its nose. But beneath its saddle, its hind quarters and shoulders were draped with a dark red cloth embroidered with silver. This must be what the girl had called its caparison, because there was a rip down one side. His mouth fell open in disbelief. The only thing that had ever time-travelled with him before was his St. Christopher. He'd never managed to bring anything else. Nothing he was carrying, not clothes, not even his watch. But this time he'd brought a living thing. It was astonishing. "It is your horse, isn't it?" she asked. "I didn't actually see you before you fell, but it's the same livery." Joe looked down at his clothes and then back at the horse's drapes. The insignia... excuse me. Got a frog in my throat. The insignia of the 3 swords was on both. He nodded. "Aren't you going to say something?" "Thank you," he said quickly. The girl laughed. "That wasn't really what I meant." Her blue eyes danced. Joe looked at her carefully. It was definitely the same face, and he could see wisps of dark hair escaping from beneath the headdress she was wearing. It had to be Lucy. "I rescued you?" he said uncertainly. The girl smiled. Not on purpose, perhaps. She leaned over and tethered Joe's horse to the branch of a tree, then jumped down from her own animal. The long skirt of her dress swung around her ankles. It was a beautiful, rich green, split at the front to show a second skirt beneath that was a startling red. Above the narrow waist of the dress, the bodice was embroidered in gold. Joe tried to remember what Tudor women wore. It looked about right, he thought, but he knew he could easily be 100 years out without realising. "There were some rough peasant boys, 5 or 6 of them," the girl was saying. "I don't think they were from the village, and they certainly weren't from the castle. They ambushed me and wouldn't let me ride on. I was scared, but then they heard you galloping towards us and ran away." She bent down and picked up a cap from the ground. "Were you looking for this?" She held it out. Joe took it. It was black and circular, with a kind of floppy frill all the way round. He put it on. "No, actually I was looking for my St. Christopher." As he expected, she looked baffled. "It's round and silver, like a coin," he said. "It fell off the chain when the horse threw me." He was about to add, "That's how I came to be here," but stopped himself. He didn't want to frighten her, since she didn't appear to know who he was. It had been like that before when he'd arrived in Jorvik. She'd had no idea they'd met at Fishbourne. "I'll help you look for it. By the way, I'm Lucy," she said, and curtsied. "Oh, good, at last," Joe said without thinking. She took a step backwards. "Why, at last?" she said warily. Joe pressed his lips together. He'd meant that at last she was actually called Lucy, rather than Lucilia, or Louis-Jacques, or some other weird variation. But he couldn't explain that to her. Not yet, anyway. "I don't really know," he said sheepishly. He gave an awkward little bow and lifted the cap from his head. "Thank you for bringing my horse to me. I'm Joe." So, we're off to a flying start, literally, with Joe, and he has taken his horse with him this time, and the horse is suddenly a Tudor horse, which struck me as quite a fun idea when I wrote this book. I hope it strikes you as a fun idea. Anyway, so that's chapter 1 of the Falconer's Quarry, and already we're in Lucy's world. Already he's met Lucy. You have some idea of what's in store if you've read or listened to either of the other books. But if you don't know, then you need to listen in again tomorrow. So I'll be back tomorrow, Tuesday, same time, 5 o'clock, same place, Facebook, or if you're finding me on YouTube, then this will be up there shortly after 5:30, because the first thing I do when I finish recording is download it so I don't lose it, and then load it up onto YouTube. Anyway, it's lovely to see some of you here, and I'll hope to see some of you tomorrow.